Hello, I'm Michael Voris.
And I'm Father Pablo, Catholic missionary priest. We really want you to watch every week the one true faith. Had you left that one true faith, please come home. We're waiting for you because we love you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The One True Faith, the show we say is the most disturbing hour on television because we talk about eternity. Our topic for this season is kind of disturbing for some people because we're talking about the occult. Lots of people don't like to hear about it because it gives them the heebie-jeebies and the creepies, and it should, because at the base of the occult is a demonic structure that parallels and mocks the Trinity and heaven and everything else that's good. But nonetheless, as heebie-jeebie and creepy as it is, we still need to talk about it, and the Catechism of the Catholic Church talks about it as well. One of the reasons we have to pay attention to this and talk about it is because a lot of the practices of the occult are sort of coming back into vogue again. Some of them have never left, others have come back into vogue, and particularly younger people, are more susceptible to these things because all of these different practices and occultist elements are finding their way into mainstream media of every kind, movies and songs and games and television shows and everything else. So it's especially important to note exactly what's going on with the occult as it kind of filters its way back in its very many different forms. Tonight, we're going to be talking about one aspect of the occult that's been around for a very long time. That's astrology and horoscopes. What astrology is the divining of the future by gazing into the heavens. Now, this may strike some people as kind of silly and stupid, but behind it is a system of, essentially, of evil. And we're going to get into that in a moment, why. But the very first thing we're going to do is first understand what is astrology. What is astrology? It's a group of systems, traditions, and beliefs which hold that the relative position of the celestial bodies to each other, relative to each other, and some other details, can provide information about personalities and human history and human events, that somehow this is mirrored in the heavens or it's controlled by the heavens and put down here on earth. That's essentially what astrology is. Astrologers believe that the movement and the positions of the heavenly bodies either directly influence the earth, events that happen on earth, or they correspond to events in human history. Now, in the West, we're talking about the sort of Greco-Roman part of the world. This belief comes from sort of the combined philosophies of the Greeks and the Egyptians, going back about 2,000 years. The Egyptians, in turn, were influenced by the Persians, and the Persians, in turn, were influenced by the Hindus. The Hindu astrological system has been around much longer than the Western astrological system has been around. The cults around the Egyptian gods Thoth and the Greek god Hermes combine. There's sort of cults around these two gods, and the cults have different writers and scribes and people who sit down and write all these different things and make their observations, and they develop a body of literature. Well, these two bodies of literature from the Greeks and the Egyptians combined into one sort of big body of literature, and one of the expressions to kind of explain astrology that comes out of this body of literature was the kind of cool saying, or deceptively cool saying, as above, so below. Now, you're supposed to be blown away by, ooh, that's got some sort of mystical sound to it, but that's pretty much a good sum up of it. What's happening above is what dictates what's going on below, that they're a reflection of each other. During the Renaissance, this stuff actually gets carried into the Renaissance 1,500 years after the original writings in Egypt. During the Renaissance, another expression that became very popular was, by looking upward, I see downward. Ooh, see, that's another cool little mystical thing. They put these are the original bumper sticker guys. They sum up their bad theology and bad philosophy in 3 or 4 words and stick it on their car. I guess back in those days, the back end of their horse. Which I guess would still qualify as a bumper sticker. Now, it's important to understand that astrology comes in different flavors. There's different traditions of astrology, and lots of people in the West don't get this at all. They just think astrology is looking up in there and figuring out if you're a Leo and then going into the paper and finding out what your horoscope is. And that's what sort of the Western mind thinks of astrology. It's not really astrology. The different flavors of astrology share some basic core beliefs, some basic foundational principles, because these have been shared between all of these cultures. The Hindus, the Persians, the Greco-Roman, the Egyptians, all of these things have shared and combined. So there are some things that are common to all of them. But they're also very different in some significant ways. There are three main bodies of astrology. There's Hindu, Chinese, and Western. Now, I don't want to get too far off the point with astrology, but I just want to show you one main difference. In Western astrology, the entire year is divided into 12 astrological symbols or signs, or the zodiac. So by the time you start from January and go all the way through the year, you've come back and down and you've covered all 12 astrological signs. When you compare that to Chinese astrology, it's very different. Chinese astrology dedicates one entire year to a sign and then moves on to the next year and doesn't it? So it takes 12 years to go through the whole cycle on Chinese astrology compared to just 1 year to go through the whole cycle in Western astrology. So immediately there are different ways in which the seers and astrologers would predict future events in Chinese astrology versus Western astrology. So right away, the core understanding is in conflict. So if this body of information presents itself as the truth, well, the people who are the sort of major practitioners of it can't even agree on how to read the heavens. So bear that in mind. That's important as we talk later on. Western astrology is really sort of a combination of the much older Hindu astrology mixed in with Greek mythology and Persian philosophy. Yeah, it's quite the soup. Western astrology is quite the combination. It's quite the stew. From each of these three branches of astrology, Western, Hindu, and Chinese, a bunch of whole different kind of esoteric traditions develop as well. Have you heard of Kabbalah? Heard someone? I don't know. Yeah, but I don't know exactly what it means. It's something to do with Madonna. Yeah. Well, Kabbalah is kind of a practice of some ancient, rare misunderstandings of Judaism combined with some flavors of Hindu astrology. And boom, you get this. It comes over to Persia, it kind of turns and twists a little bit, combines with Judaism, and then you produce this thing that most Jews say that stuff's crazy. It has nothing to do with Judaism. But nonetheless, you can start to see how astrology and the principles of it sort of work their way into some other different religions and things like that. Same thing's going on today with the New Age movement and how lots of Christians gobble up certain parts of it. So the point of all this is that astrology is not just some simple view of the world. It's like we look in the horoscope and go, oh, so this is astrology. No. Looking in the newspaper, to find your horoscope and what's going to happen to you today is a watered-down, westernized, Americanized version of astrology. It's kind of the simple, stupid version of astrology that Americans seem to have done with lots of things like the hamburger, for example. But the horoscope does reveal something about astrology. It's based on the original system from thousands of years ago, so it does tell us something about the astrological systems, kind of like the very tip of the iceberg, does tell us something about the huge mass of the iceberg underneath the waterline. So let's talk about the horoscope. The horoscope comes from a word that's kind of a combination of Greek words, which means observing the hour of birth. That's what the word horoscope means. And it is central to Western astrology, to understanding Western astrology. The horoscope is built around the zodiac, the 12 symbols, the 12 constellations that are so named. Zodiac is another Greek-derived word, meaning a circle or diameter of animals. The diac, D-I-A, is like diameter, and the zo is where we get the word zoo from, or zoology. It's a circle of animals. Why? Because as you're standing on Earth in ancient Greece or the ancient world looking at the heavens move, from our perspective, move in a circular fashion. So they went, oh, look, there's an animal, and they're moving in a circle. So this must be a zodiac. So that's where the word comes from. Just found that out today, so I'm kind of excited about it. The ancients looked up in the night sky, and they saw the pattern of the stars repeating year after year. So they began to track them. This isn't news. You knew this from 5th grade. Since science and religion back in the ancient days were not seen as distinct and separate, they were joined together. They were seen as the same thing. And because of that, the scientific observations of the day, and it is a scientific observation to go, oh, look, that star always comes out first, or every time it turns cold, those two stars appear over there, or whatever it is. All these different empirical data that people are gathering start to have religious connotations slapped on top of them, religious connotations of the day. And they become overlapped. The religious and scientific beliefs and structures and observations become overlapped with each other, and it becomes the case that the planets become associated with gods, and gods become associated with the planets. These gods had the ability to, the people believed, they had the ability to direct or influence human affairs, human actions here on earth. And for those humans who were smart enough and had the secret knowledge to discern the ways of the gods, they could look up into the sky and they could predict what was going to happen based on the movement of the stars. These astrologers. Here's where the secret knowledge of the occult once again comes in. If you've seen any of the other shows, we've talked about this. The common thread running through the occult is that I have a secret knowledge that no one else has, and that secret knowledge makes me powerful. Whether I'm a witch, an astrologer, a fortune teller, a tarot card, or whatever it is, that's the heart of the occult. That I have a knowledge of things that humans should not have a knowledge of. That makes me special, and it makes me a rival to God. It's unclear whether the ancients actually believed that the heavenly bodies were the gods, or if they just assigned a god to the heavenly body. We don't know whether they actually thought the star actually was the god Jupiter, or they just said, oh, Jupiter's in charge of that star. We don't know that exactly. But in either case, whichever way it went, the planets today now bear the names of the gods of the ancient world. That's telling. The ancient pagan world, as distinguished from the modern pagan world, and it is, was dominated. It was dominated by their belief in astrology. A lot of people just simply do not realize how ancient Greece and Persia, everything was about astrology. Absolutely everything. Armies wouldn't move because the astrologer would advise the king, don't go do this, don't go do that, the stars aren't right. And they'd stop battle, or they wouldn't attack. Or instead of finishing up, they would just all of a sudden stop and retreat because of what the stars said. So much of the ancient world was controlled by these astrologers' interpretations of what was going on in the heavens that history was sort of written based on these guys, the advice these guys gave their kings. In the Old Testament, there are numerous condemnations against star worship. It's so prevalent in the ancient world that there are 8 or 9 different passages in the Old Testament condemning it outright. There aren't very many things in the Old Testament that get condemned continually, repeatedly throughout all of Jewish history. But there aren't many. There are a few, but one of them is astrology. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 19 says, "And when you look up to the heavens and behold the sun or the moon or any star among the heavenly hosts, do not be led astray into adoring them and serving them. These the Lord your God has let fall to the lot of all the other nations under the heavens." Why? God does not want His people doing what all the rest of the other nations are doing, which is worshiping the stars. So right there in Deuteronomy, He says, don't do what all the rest of them are doing, which is star worship. In 2 Kings chapter 17, we hear, quote, "They disregarded all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves 2 molten calves. They also made a sacred pole and worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served Baal." End quote. Jeremiah during the Babylonian captivity says in chapter 8, quote, "that the bones of the citizens of Jerusalem will be emptied out of their graves and spread out before the sun and the moon and the whole army of heaven, which they loved and served, which they followed, consulted, and worshipped. They will not be gathered up for burial, but will lie like dung upon the ground." End quote. Those are pretty strict admonitions from God about messing with the stars. Why? It's not that anything's particularly wrong with the stars. It's because of what's going on in your brain in the background. You are trying to access divine knowledge. Astrology is referred to as a divination. You are trying to become divine and know what the gods are saying or doing. And that's why God instructs the Jews, have nothing to do with this. I'm your God, you trust me. You don't look up into things that I've created and try to figure out my will for you. Or, worse, try to figure out what's going to happen in the future. You don't engage in this sort of thing, divination. You have nothing to do with it. There are at least 5 other references in the Old Testament condemning the worship of stars. Now, by the time the New Testament era rolls around, astrologers taught that all things were in the grip of fate. By the time the New Testament era rolls around, the Greek culture, the Hellenistic culture, has really spread all over the whole Mediterranean world, which is where the New Testament is preached. And the Greek thought of the fates, the 3 goddesses that kind of control everything, including the other gods and people's destinies and human destiny. And when this person is born, the fates determine what's going to happen to them as opposed to this person. Then this person will do that. So this idea of fate, capital F as a god, fate had sort of imbued the whole culture, the whole society. So there were temples to fate, and there were gods, and you made worship to fate, and this sort of thing. So the ancient world then believed that fate could assign a destiny to one individual and an entirely different destiny to another individual. How could you read this? By looking at the stars. When was a person born? When a person was born, now we can look up and say, that this exact moment they were born, that means the sun was ascending at 2 degrees, and it happened on March 12th, and this happened, and da-da-da, and they figured it out. So that means right now you're going to be poor for the rest of your life, or you're going to be filthy rich, or whatever it is. So fate was considered to be extremely, extremely powerful. And some astrologers even imagined that fate ruled the other gods. It was believed that what destiny fate assigned to each man could be determined by reading the stars. What your astrologer said is what your fate was going to be, or your destiny was going to be for the rest of your life. Today, some Christians are influenced by the revived paganism in the form of the New Age movement. You go through some New Age material and you bump into, left and right, you bump into astrological hints and suggestions. Now, they're not going to necessarily flip you through and say, here's a horoscope, and today you're going to bump into an old friend, or your boss is going to give you a promotion. That stuff is, I'm sure the ancients would be really seriously offended by that, because this stuff is much more stupid than their stuff, which was just stupid. So some even suggest that Christianity originally held many occultic beliefs, some of these astrological beliefs. There's different researchers and scientists and archaeologists will dig up some old church and say, hey, look on the floor here. There's the zodiac is here. Oh, look, Christianity used to be pagan and used to believe in the gods of the stars and skies and all this. Well, sure, the zodiac sign is there, but it doesn't mean what they're importing, what kind of meaning they're injecting into it. The early Christians, like the Jews, were vehemently opposed to anything to do with astrology. They even attributed it to demonic origin, which they're actually right. The church fathers, for example, from the 1st century on, imposed very strong sanctions against anybody who started preaching astrological garbage, and they did that obviously to protect their flocks. For example, in the year 120, this is less than 100 years after Jesus has ascended and gone to heaven. In the year 120, there was a noted mathematician in Rome called Aquila Ponticus. He was excommunicated from the church at Rome for his astrological heresies. He's kicked out. We have a record of that. So less than 100 years into it, there's somebody going on about, astrology, and good for them. They didn't let him go on for 30 years, if you know what I'm talking about. They didn't let him hang around with his heresies for 30 years. They said, get out, take a hike. So Tatian, another church father, said, and this is a quote from him, quote, such are the demons. These are they who laid down the doctrine of fate. Their fundamental principle was the placing of animals in the heavens as constellations. These they dignified with celestial honor. Tatian's writing in the 2nd century. Tertullian, writing in the 3rd century, says, one proposition I lay down, quote, that those angels, the deserters of God, the demons, were likewise the discoverers of this curious art, astrology, on that account also condemned by God. Hippolytus says in his great work, The Refutation Against Heresies, quote, but what similarity is there of these constellations with the likeness of animals, or what community of nature are regards, conduct, and energy, that one should allege that a person born in Leo should be irascible like a lion, and that one born in Virgo, moderate like a virgin, or one born in Cancer, wicked like a crab. Yeah, you know, it's kind of funny. I really like that quote. When I was like 12 years old and looking at all this stuff for the first time, I'm going, what, these dots don't look like a lion. This doesn't, a crab? How do you get a crab out of 4 dots? And so, anyway, you got older, we used to make jokes about people smoking funny stuff in ancient Greece, looking up in the sky, imagining that there's animals and crabs and things up there. Augustine also got in the act on this, as he always had very well-ordered thoughts. You present something to Augustine, he'd look at it, he'd say, let me run this through logic. Let me run this through certain philosophical principles. And when he was going through his conversion, he went through many, many different heresies until he finally winds up with Christianity. He comes up to the astrologers and he says, quote, now I also had repudiated the lying divination and impious absurdities of the astrologers, and I turned my thoughts to those that are born twins, who generally come out of the womb so near to one another in time that the small distance of time between them cannot be noted by human observation or be expressed in those planetary figures which the astrologer is to examine that he may pronounce the truth. Nor can they be true, for looking into the same figures, he must have foretold the same of Esau and Jacob, whereas the same did not happen to them. See, that's the fantastic, great Catholic tradition of like, you're going to tell me something, let me think about it. Oh, that's stupid. It doesn't make sense. It's beautiful. Love that word. Just adopt that word into theology. See, astrology's horoscopes are built around a very complex system of locating not just the month, doesn't matter just what month you're in, but there's a whole bunch of stuff involved here. One of them is called the ascendant. How high is the sun? They call it the house. Where is the sun in the house when you are born at the precise moment you're born? And Augustine's point, obviously, is, well, wait a second. If 2 twins come plopping out within 2 seconds of each other, but one turns up to be king of the world and the other's a pauper, wouldn't they have the same fortune? No. So, stupid. So this whole system of trying to predict the future based exactly on where you were born and where you are and where the sun is and what house the moon is in and blah, 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 it makes no sense, which is what Augustine's point was. And Hippolytus's point is much greater also, that he just simply says, well, hey, look, you can't look up there and see an animal. It's 3 dots. That's a triangle. It's not an elephant or whatever. So what a horoscope or an astrologist does is they take their data, they plug it into their astrological zodiac horoscope chart, and they come up with predictions. And this is where the intellect should take over, as we see. And we just said Augustine and Hippolytus both apply the rich Catholic tradition of the intellect to these things and say, wait, this is dumb. I'm dismissing this. This has no basis in reality. It can't be true, because here's an example of where it doesn't work. So, boom, doesn't work. Now, when we come back, we're going to take a look at what the stars and Christianity really do have in common. And oh, yes, they do have a lot in common. We'll talk about that as soon as we get back. Just a second. Welcome back to the One True Faith. I want to go over just one more time. We're talking about astrology, and astrology falls under divination. And this is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, what the Church says about divination. All forms of divination are to be rejected. Recourse to Satan or demons, conjuring up the dead, or other practices falsely supposed to unveil the future. Consulting horoscopes, Astrology, palm reading, interpretation of omens and lots, the phenomena of clairvoyance, and recourse to mediums all conceal a desire for power over time, history, and in the last analysis, other human beings, as well as a wish to conciliate hidden powers. That is paragraph number 2116 from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So, divination, all this crazy stuff, is to be absolutely avoided and shunned. It is a mortal sin. Make no mistake about it. So, now, since the beginning of human history, we've looked up into the heavens. Man has looked up into the cosmos with a religious awe. We still do. We still do. How many times when you're sitting there in front of your computer and it's like, boom, here's another picture from the Hubble spacecraft or something, and you look and you're like, oh, and you just pause. No matter what you're doing, you pause and you look at it, you're like, wow, that's incredibly beautiful. You're just struck by the awe and the wonder of it. And we don't see it so much these days because of all the bright lights of cities. But, if you go way, way, way out into the country somewhere and all of a sudden you're out there and it's a beautiful, clear night, and you look up and the stars are just mind-boggling. They're beautiful. I had a job in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and there's not many earthly lights in Cheyenne, Wyoming at nighttime. There's a few lanterns lit up and down the streets, but and you could see the stars beautifully up there. The whole night was lit up by the stars. It's gorgeous. You can see how people would have been so amazed and just in awe of these. But all of these different cultures began looking at these from a religious bent. The Babylonians and the Chinese watched the stars for omens. The North American Indians kept track of novas. The Greeks named their constellations after their gods. Stonehenge was built in England to track the movement of the heavens, and the Egyptians worshiped the sun. All over the known world, throughout all of history, the heavens were always and continue to be this source of awe for humans. Now, the Jews looked to the heavens as well, but they looked to the heavens in an entirely different way than everybody else, which is the prohibition against doing it the way all the rest of the nations are doing it that we said in Deuteronomy earlier. Psalm 8 really sums up the kind of Jewish perspective on the stars and the heavens. When I see your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars that you set in place, what are humans that you should be mindful of them? Mere mortals that you should care for them. You have made them a little less than a god, crowned them with glory and honor. See, this view of the stars is not just a difference in quality, like it is between the Chinese and the Egyptians and the Babylonians and all of that. It's a difference in kind from the pagan world. The pagan world assigned divine powers to the heavens. The Jews properly understood that the heavens were a sign pointing to the divinity himself, that they were just part of creation. It's evidence of a sacramental understanding of the world, of the universe, really. Israel saw itself as the beginning of a new world, a new order in creation, symbolized by the heavenly host. You'll hear this expression continually throughout the Old Testament, the heavenly host, because they saw themselves standing with and alongside the heavenly host. When the temple is built, how is the temple built? It's built as a model of the temple in heaven. This is the whole point of this is why God gives the specific instructions. Build it this way. It'll be this big. It'll be that high. Make it this. God's the one who lays down the blueprint for the temple when Solomon builds the temple. And the Jews understand rightly that there is a connection between heaven and earth. Not the heavenly bodies as such, but between heaven and earth. There is this thing that heaven is a reflection, is reflected on earth. And we see something of heaven in the material creation. The link for the Jews between the heavenly host and the earthly host of Israel was very, very strong in the biblical mind. And the reason why is because both are ruled over by God. This is God's realm out there, and this is God's realm here too. What's the connection? What's the common thing? God. And since God is the common connection, then we are somehow related to these heavens, to heaven itself, even here on earth. This is a very sacramental understanding. Physical things, the physical creation links us to God somehow. This sacramental understanding is very, very, very key to the Jews. What do we mean by sacramental? That it points to God. What's a sacrament of the church? Not a sacramental, but what's a sacrament of the church? It's a visible sign instituted by Christ to bring grace. It's a visible sign. What's a sign? Something that points to another reality. A sacramental is something that points to God. So the Jews understand creation as a sacrament, and aspects of it are sacramental because they point to God. So from the Jewish perspective, the earthly tabernacle was a miniature of God's heavenly dwelling. The temple, God lives in the temple for the Jews. He's there, and He's in His heavenly temple at the same time. There's this relationship between the two. This thing when Ezekiel, in the beginning of Ezekiel, when God leaves the temple, there's that wonderful thing at the beginning of, I think it's chapter 6 of Ezekiel, somewhere in the beginning of Ezekiel, I might be wrong on the chapter. God leaves the temple, and they give this description of this chariot and the wheels on the chariot and and God departs the temple, and He leaves. And this is earth-shattering to the Jews. And what happens? The temple is destroyed by the Babylonians, and off they go into captivity. So both heaven and earth in the Jewish mindset are attended by the armies of the Lord, the people of Israel on earth and the angels in heaven, respectively, heaven and earth. So we see, for example, in Genesis chapter 37, that Jacob and his sons are likened to the sun, the moon, and the 12 stars, because the Jews understand the connection between the cosmos and them here on earth. But they understand rightly that the cosmos is part of creation. It is not God or divine in itself. So there's this intimate connection between heaven and earth. This understanding will prepare for the soon-to-be revealed truth, once our Lord comes to earth, that heaven is reflected on earth. Not fully, but it's still reflected, especially in the sacrifice of the Mass. Various parts of the Mass, if you listen closely to the language, reflect this understanding that heaven is somehow reflected on earth. Take the first Eucharistic prayer in Mass. Almighty God, we pray that your angel may take this sacrifice to your altar in heaven. There's this tie-in, this connection. Wait. So this sacrifice here is also going to be in heaven? See, there's the tie-in. What do we say in Mass when we say, lift up your hearts? We lift them up to the Lord. What's going on there? We're lifting our hearts up as heaven is descending down. If you go look through some of the older cathedrals in Europe and some of the wonderful cathedrals around the world, you'll see tons of stars painted on the ceiling. Why? It has nothing to do with zodiac or belief in astrology. It has everything to see with the connections, that these are the vaults of heaven. And so this is the way Catholics and Christians understand the heavens, not this pagan garbage of being able to tell how rich somebody's going to be when they grow up. The conviction that earth and heaven are both guided by a common creator, this conviction runs throughout Scripture. We're told in the book of Judges, for example, quote, from their course the stars fought against Sisera. Sisera was a captain of the Canaanite army, and the stars fought against him. Connection, again, between heaven and earth. Likewise, both Ezekiel and Revelation portray heavenly creatures around the throne of God. They heavenly creatures, in the heavens creatures, not heavenly like people hanging around with wings and halos, but the bodies of the stars in heaven hanging around the throne of God, that correspond to the constellations. Scholars point out, for example, that the 4 cherubim mentioned in chapter 4 of the book of Revelation conform to the middle signs in the 4 quarters of the zodiac. The lion is Leo, the ox is Taurus, the man is Aquarius, and the eagle is Scorpio. Now, that's not to say that we used to believe in, the signs of the zodiac, no. It's the people who don't understand the real connection between heaven and earth that have misconstrued and given these things all kinds of powers. But even in the Gospel of John, John lists them in a counterclockwise order from the zodiac. The ox, the man, the eagle, and the bull. But see, the difference, again, between the pagans and the Christians is that we don't worship the stars. We don't use the stars to divine future events. We don't invest them with that kind of power. We worship the one who put them in place as a sign pointing back to himself. That's an enormous difference. That is, as a matter of fact, the entire difference. In the words of the 19th Psalm, the heavens are telling the glory of God. They point to God. See, to the ancient biblical mind, the groupings of the stars are not random. Nothing in creation is random. The macrocosm, when you look at the whole universe of creation, it shows the glory of God writ very large across the skies. And the microcosm of something like the temple for the Jews shows his glory on a human scale. Small or large, they both reflect the glory of God. And they're both connected to each other because they reflect the glory of God. So for biblical authors, as for us, everything is connected, but it's not the stars doing the connecting. It's God doing the connecting. It's God, the creator of heaven and earth, the creator of the stars, who's connecting all of this up. But now for some Christians, I'm getting into a little touchy area here. For some Christians, mostly not Catholics, the universe is not held in a correct understanding. They want to take the spiritual truths of revelation and impose them on top of scientific data, which denies the truth of the scientific data. The fact that they want to sort of persist in these beliefs, I'm talking about creationists, the fact that they want to persist in these beliefs, despite all the evidence to the contrary, tells us that they're confusing physical reality with spiritual reality. To maintain, in the face of all scientific evidence, scientific truth, that the world is just a few thousand years old, holds no weight scientifically at all. It simply doesn't. It's an incorrect reading of the sacred scriptures. They are making the same type of mistake or error that atheists make, but they're making it in the other direction. For example, H.G. Wells said, "Man is utterly insignificant compared to the size of the universe." So apparently H.G. Wells thought size mattered. Well, if you've seen those TV shows on like the Science Channel or the History Channel or something, you go through those things, you'll see that, here's Earth, and then it, the whole screen is Earth, and then it turns into this like smaller things. They're zooming out, this little blue marble, and it gets smaller and smaller, and it gets sucked into the solar system, and the solar system gets sucked into the Milky Way, and the Milky Way gets sucked into this galaxy, and it keeps going. And all of a sudden, you're like, ooh, wow, we really are insignificant, don't we? You've heard that on how many, man is really an insignificant blip in the history of the universe. Earth is just this little dot. Carl Sagan, as a matter of fact, says of planet Earth that we are just a, quote, small blue dot. Well, God doesn't think that. Maybe Sagan does, but God doesn't. So to argue against the atheists, you would say, who say that, what's our answer to them? Size doesn't matter. Am I less important than the John Hancock building or the Sears Tower or whatever because I'm this big and that's 400 stories or whatever it is tall? No. Size doesn't determine your importance. So to argue against the creationists, location doesn't matter either. Creationists maintain that the earth is the center of the universe. So over here you got the atheists arguing that size determines what's important. Over here you've got the creationists who say they believe in God, saying that location matters. Neither one of them are right. Spiritual truths don't get combined with in such a way that they produce a contradiction with scientific truth. There was a famous Catholic whose name was Galileo, and he said, the purpose of revelation is to tell us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. And it's a very, very smart saying. And see, therein lies the enormous difference between Christianity and paganism, between revelation and astrology. The heavens point to God in a large manner, but each man's destiny is determined by that man here on earth. Big difference. Big difference. So, if you're in a habit of picking up your horoscope, stop. We'll be right back right after this. Well, welcome back to The One True Faith. We are in the part of our show where we take questions from the studio audience, and our topic today is astrology. Man, what's your name? Where are you from?
Joseph, and I'm from Waterford.
Right, what's
so,
your question?
What is the difference between astronomy and astrology?
That's an excellent question. Back in the days of the ancients, astronomy, which is the science of studying what's going on with the stars moving and being able to figure out, oh, the sun's going to come up at this time tomorrow and that sort of thing, simplistic view of it. All of that used to be bound up together with astrology, meaning that instead of just figuring out that the sun's going to come up at 7:04 tomorrow, you would say the sun's going to come up at 7:04 tomorrow because the god Apollo is going to push it up at 7:04 tomorrow. And that's how it was for many, 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 many millennia. Eventually, astronomy, the science part of it, starts to break off. Astrology kind of goes off into the kind of goofy world. But astronomy becomes an actual science, looking at how far, understanding like Halley's Comet, for example, and when a supernova happens, and what's a black hole, and all these kinds of scientific things that we send space shuttles up to measure, and the Hubble telegraph to take pictures of, and all that. That's astronomy. So back in the day, they were sort of the same thing, but now they're two different things. Anybody who's Christian, Catholic, is everything about astronomy is perfectly fine. As far as the studying of the science. Now, some people take that and say, oh, look at this. There's astronomy says that proves that there's no God. Well, that obviously is wrong. But just the science of it, just observing the scientific data and making notes of it and developing theories about how big the universe might be and stuff like that, all that's perfectly fine. It's very different from astrology today, whereas, a couple thousand years ago, it used to be sort of the same thing. Two different worlds now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, what's your name? Where are you from?
Mark from Windsor, Canada.
Hello, Mark. What's your question?
What harm, Mike, could there possibly be in people reading their daily horoscope?
Intellectually or spiritually or both?
Yes.
Intellectually, it's really just sort of stupid. It's one thing if you get like a fortune cookie in front of you where it's right in front of you, but I mean to go make a point, to go run off and grab the paper and read your horoscope, it feeds into this kind of belief that there's some way of knowing something other than what we're supposed to know. And in that sense, it can be spiritually harmful to some people. Now, if it is just nothing but a joke and that's it, and that's all you're really, I would still advise, isn't there something else you could do? Couldn't you say like a glory be to the Father or something instead of opening up and reading a horoscope? There's got to be some better use of your time to do something. On a spiritual level, some people, just because of their psychologies and their experiences and their backgrounds, this starts to pose a danger by suggestion. People look at things and they get suggestions that, and some people, because they're either weak-minded or weak-willed or not well-educated or whatever, look at this stuff and they start to kind of guide their lives by it. We, read that that Nancy Reagan in the White House had an astrologer coming in. And you're thinking to yourself, well, I certainly hope they weren't making, policy based on what the astrologer was saying. And you start to see all these things. And you know what? It feeds into the culture. It feeds into this culture. Maybe one person innocently sitting there looking at his or her horoscope over their Rice Krispies in the morning might not be that big of a deal. But you know what? When 1 million or 10 million or 50 million people are doing that, and everybody knows what their sign is. Did the same equal number of people know that they have a guardian angel? So it's this constant it's like, death by 1,000 slashes, 1,000 knives. Why participate in something that is virtually, well, on the intellectual side, is void of any intellect at all? Even astrologers, true astrologers, say the horoscopes are stupid. So why, I don't get it. It's just, intellectually, why would you do it? Spiritually, it poses a danger. It poses a danger because it presents something just sitting there as innocent that feeds into an entire system behind it. And what if somebody's sitting here, what if some innocent kid is reading it and going, oh, what does that mean I'm a Leo? And starts exploring it and all of a sudden goes off track and says, oh, look, the stars. And, it's something that's not true. So why do you want to spend time with it? That's bad intellectually, it's bad spiritually, always.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Michael.
Frank. Does everybody know Frank?
Yeah, I guess I'm spiritually schizophrenic here. I'm a dog under Chinese, and I think I'm a bull under Western astrology. But I don't believe in any of that stuff anyway.
I guess you were a rat.
God's all truth,
Yes.
perfect truth. And Augustine said astrology is a lie. It's nonsense. So I'm not arguing at all with Augustine. So how you go back to the Gospel of Matthew, where it says wise men or astrologers from the east saw the star rising and followed it in search of the newborn King of the Jews. If it's nonsense, how could they be following that star?
Because they didn't assign to the star divine powers. They followed it as what? A sign leading somewhere. And as they, God can use His creation in whatever way He wants. And if at the time, not today with our scientific knowledge, but at the time, 2,000 years ago, these magi are observing the heavens, and all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, what's going on here with this star? And it arouses their curiosity, and they begin to follow it. Well, what did it lead them to? I mean, that's the ultimate astrological sign pointing to God. It comes and rests right over God Himself in the stable. So that God can, but again, the Magi don't use this as they don't worship the star. They understand that the star is leading to something else. That's a whole different understanding than other astrologers of the time who are actually saying, oh, this is God and that's God, and they worship this star, and this is a constellation and it's named after these gods and so forth. But an interesting point that if you look at a pack of tarot cards, there's all sorts of different characters in the tarot cards. There's the magician, which is where the magi come from, magi. And the magician on the tarot card is standing, pointing with a stick or a wand up to the heavens, but also to the earth, because the magician understands in the tarot card system, in the astrological system, that there's a connection between heaven and earth. That there is a connection between heaven and earth isn't the issue. It's what meaning do you give that connection. The Magi give the connection, or give the meaning they take, is that this star is a portend of something great to happen. And what do? They go and they say, we're looking for the birth of a new king, and that's what gets Herod all upset, and he eventually kills all the young holy innocents. So they understand that the star itself is just a sign. They don't attach divine power to the star. They understand that, and that's the difference. And we're the same way. I mean, if you rush forward to us, we're not looking for a star doing something as a sign, but we look up in the sky and go, wow, this is beautiful, isn't this gorgeous? I mean, just on a personal spiritual note, every single time I see one of those bright, brilliant full moons, I think of the Eucharist. It's this beautiful, round, glowing disc, and it points to God. I mean, the Eucharist obviously is God, but visibly as you look at it, it's God, and it points to the greater reality of God. So the fact that the psalmists and different folks who've written, different authors in the sacred Scripture and the church fathers all look to the heavens and see the connection, just as the Magi did, is perfectly in line with our understanding of God. It's that horrible pagan stuff that these stars have some sort of power of their own, or the gods are moving them around, or whatever it is. Interestingly, back in the day, the ancient days, people used to assign angels, that it was the angels who were moving the stars around. And keeping the heavenly bodies in motion and all that, and that's what they did. And that belief sort of drifted also into Christianity to a little degree as well. So the connection between the heavens and the earth has always been there. It's what meaning do you give it that matters.
Thank you much.
You're welcome. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back up to closing comments. One of the duties of Christians as Catholics, is laid out by the Church, is called the spiritual works of mercy, admonishing the sinner, instructing the ignorant, so forth. We live in a world today where Christian truth has been overwhelmed by the culture, and the culture is decidedly unchristian. It's a culture of death, it's a culture of lies, it's a culture of ignorance, it's a culture of stupidity. As Catholic Christians, who our blessed Lord says, you are the light of the world, you are the salt of the earth, we have a duty, an obligation to our neighbor. We are our brother's keeper. We do have an obligation to bring the truth to the world. We don't get to keep it for ourselves. We must go out there and we must preach what the truth is. 50 years ago, you got to pass on this because everybody believed pretty much the same thing. Today, they don't. You believe the truth, you have to go out and preach it, live it, love it, learn it, do everything you need to do. That's why our job is to defend the truth and proclaim the truth and fight for the truth. And when it comes to the realm of the occult, whatever form it is, the astrology, fortune-telling, Ouija boards, whatever it is, it's a lie, it's demonic in its origin, and it goes against the truth of Christ. You must defend the truth of Christ. That's why you're baptized, that's why you're confirmed, that's why you go to Mass, to be a soldier for Christ, to be the church militant. That is your obligation, it is my obligation. So, when you're at a party or something and someone brings up, oh, what sign are you? Say, I am the sign of the cross. Goodbye. God love you. We'll see you next week on The One True Faith.